Hey everyone, Carmen here, Managing Digital Editor at Ms. We're back in action at the National Sexual Assault Conference, and I am with Julie Germann, the founder of Finding the Right, an organization that trains police and prosecutors on handling sex crimes. So thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And yeah, I was very interested when you reached out to me by sort of your journey to finding the right, to founding this organization. And so I'd love if you could share a little bit about what brings you to this movement in this space and what sort of led you to move from the courtroom to that advocacy side.
Sure. So I was a prosecutor for about 12 years in Minnesota, and a majority of those 12 years, my caseload focused on sexual assault crimes against both adults and children, serious physical child abuse and child homicides. And in that time, what I found was a broken system. A lot of individuals who meant really well and tried really hard, because I don't mean to demean prosecutors, I think it's the hardest job you'll ever love, but we weren't serving victims. We weren't doing justice. And I thought that there has to be a better way. And so now Finding the Right is not just about training, but it's about system change, changing the entire system to serve crime victims better.
Yeah, and what do you think has to change? Like, what do you think is broken and what shifts have to happen?
Sure. So there's sort of, especially around sexual violence, we come from a system that starts from the premise that women lie about rape. And that goes back to our earliest laws that came over here from England, this idea that a woman's statement about rape had to be corroborated by someone else, or she had to resist to her utmost, or it had to be witnessed by someone, or it just wasn't rape. And that underlies our criminal justice system and actually our whole society, where we start from the premise that a woman who alleges rape must be lying. And so we have to start from the foundation of correcting that assumption and starting from a place of believing victims and supporting them. It's indicative of why women don't come forward when they're raped, because the system treats them so badly and starts from the presumption that they must have made this up.
Yeah, and so what sort of resources do you think, like what tools do prosecutors have to be part of that system change while also being inside that system?
So prosecutors are the gatekeepers to the criminal justice system. If they don't charge the case, it doesn't get in. That is an unappealable decision for a victim. If the prosecutor says, no, I don't think I can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, she doesn't get to go to court. And so the biggest way to fix that is getting to the prosecutors and talking about what our charging standard is. Across the country, I talk to prosecutors and I hear the same thing. They say, a jury in my community won't buy that. A jury in my community won't convict on that. And very often they're talking about victims who were vulnerable in some way because they were intoxicated or had used drugs, or they're talking about a victim who was raped by someone she knew. And they think that juries will only convict on that real rape myth, the stranger jumping out of the bushes with a mask and a gun. And so what we have to start from the premise is, if we charge to that standards of what juries will accept right now, and we know that our juries believe myths and biases about sexual assault, then we have made myths and biases the rule of law in this country. And so we have to start with the prosecutors and say, no, you can't say my jury won't buy that. You have to say, how can I educate my jury so they understand? How can I help my jury get past the bias, get past the myth, look at the facts of this case, apply the law, and do the right thing?
Totally. And in the years that you've been doing Finding the Right, what reverberations have you seen in terms of system change? Like, have there been a lot of instances of sort of, that shift and that moment of education or coming of conscience?
Certainly. I have a lot of young prosecutors reach out to me after my conferences with questions and follow-up and wanting additional help. And in their questions, I see them taking on the harder cases. I see them taking something to trial that they previously would have declined and asking for help in that. And So you're starting to see those shifts. Another thing that I really advocate for is transparency in the criminal justice system, and I'm starting to see systems do that as well. Starting to audit their cases, report more broadly to the public how many cases they're prosecuting, how many they're declining, because we can't fix the system until we can identify what's broken. And there's been a lot of lack of transparency in the criminal justice system. Nobody knows how many cases are investigated, how many are prosecuted, how many people go to prison every year. And so I'm starting to see systems voluntarily take that step towards transparency. And I think that's a huge step on the path to justice. So.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, just sort of on the advocacy and the activism side, I think so often people are really disappointed, right, in the outcomes of high-profile rape cases, whether it's a celebrity case like the sort of back and forth that we initially saw with the Cosby case, or whether it's, you know, these judges who are like, well, he's a good kid and he has a good future. And what sort of lessons have you learned doing this work, like in the courtroom and now also with finding the right? What lessons and takeaways do you think activists should take away from, you know, like how do you think that we can be more precise in the way we try to navigate the legal system and create change in that structure?
So, you know, I think advocates, they've done a phenomenal job. They continue to do a phenomenal job. When I teach prosecutors, I tell them that advocates are absolutely your best friend. And when I was a baby prosecutor, I didn't do everything right. And I tell my audiences that I didn't do everything right. And a lot of the people who helped me learn that I wasn't doing it right were advocates, right? They taught me more about victims. They taught me more about trauma and how to work with victims than I ever learned in law school or anywhere else. I think victims navigating the system, they need to be vocal. You know, when we talk about these judges who do things that just look so contrary to justice, they don't give a sentence because he's a nice kid, he has a future in college. I think when the media and when our advocates bring that to light and society as a whole can react to that, when the voting population can say no more from that judge, right? We're going to take him off the bench, or that pressure from the media causes these folks to step down. I mean, I think that's where we need to see advocacy going, not just helping the victim, but really helping society understand what's happening in our justice system.
Yeah, and what do you think, you know, just sort of riffing on the conference theme of going beyond the breakthrough, what do you think the justice system overall, or at least this aspect of it, this sort of the trials, the charges, the convictions, in what way can we leverage the power of that aspect of the justice system to push us beyond the breakthrough? Like, how do you think all those pieces are connected?
So the way I see beyond the breakthrough is I feel like the Me Too movement was so powerful, and it brought to light what so many of us have been working on for years and years. And it brought it to the forefront. But those kind of social movements can very quickly fade away and have no long-lasting repercussions. So we really need to move towards a Me Too Chapter 2, which is an aspect of a nonprofit called Responding Against Violence that I'm helping to start. And really that Chapter 2 is taking that energy from the Me Too movement and going beyond that breakthrough that we had. We have society's attention now. What are we going to do about it? What long-term systemic changes are we going to make to our justice system to better serve victims?
Yeah, and I've also been sort of grappling with in the last day, thinking a lot about the connection between accountability and really this larger culture change, right? Like the goal of Me Too isn't necessarily let's put all the bad people, let's get them all in trouble. It's really about, I never felt like anyone was held accountable, and that's endemic of this rape culture, right? Where no one cares that there is widespread violence. What do you think the reverberations of the work that you're doing and the work that others are doing to hold people accountable, how do you think that filters down into really, you know, changing that culture and sort of shifting behavior?
Right. I think awareness is certainly the first part, and I think our younger generations are much more aware of sexual violence, that it happens. I think that the problems that we see with our juries of today will not be our problems that we have with juries 10 or even 15 years from now, as some of these folks are coming of age and getting on voter rolls and will serve on our juries. So it definitely reverberates down. And I think I forgot the rest of your question. I apologize.
Like the connections, I guess, between accountability and, sort of behavior change and culture change away from a rape culture.
Well, and that's outside of the justice system, I think. But accountability, where I see that is I see parents talking to their children about being responsible and accountable for the decisions they make regarding their sexual behavior. I see parents saying, hey, if either of you have had anything to drink, wait, right? When you're sober, have all the sex you want. When you're drunk, no, because you can't perceive well then if you're both consenting to that. And so the awareness brings about the conversations that spark the education and the change into how we engage in sexual behavior and how we're responsible for that. And I think hopefully that will change the culture and ultimately change the amount of sexual violence that we see in this country.
Yeah, and then certainly, encouraging prosecutors and police to not mishandle or dismiss cases of sexual violence is so important. What policy or sort of larger changes on that scale do you think would also advance the opportunities that survivors have in the justice system? Because I know, that survivors feel like they have very limited access to justice. So are there policies that could help?
So there's some interesting things happening on that front. In Utah, there was a little known aspect of their constitution that would allow victims whose serious sexual assault charges were declined by their local prosecutor to take that to the state attorney general's office for a second review. And it was just this little known clause of their constitution, and 4 victims in Utah who had had their cases dismissed or declined by a prosecutor went to court to try and say, no, we're going to enforce this. We want this second look at this. And ultimately, Utah's legislature did the right thing and said, yep, that we're going to allow this. This is going to be law. We're going to, in Utah. And so there's an opportunity for victims to have that second look. And so maybe if they had a prosecutor who was biased or wasn't brave, they get that second shot. We're also seeing in Austin, Texas, where I'm from, where it's coming to light that sexual assaults have been mishandled, not investigated, and not prosecuted for a very long time. We have victims who have taken a class action lawsuit in federal court against both the DA and law enforcement there. So I see victims exercising their rights, exercising their voice, and trying to find a different path to justice when they have been denied one. And so I think long-term, a policy change, what's happening in Utah, this opportunity for a second look by fresh eyes from a different prosecutor, that's brilliant, right? And if 2 prosecutors independently both say this is not a case that can go forward, there isn't evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, then that's what happens. But it takes away the risk of having one person having so much power in the system.
Totally. And you touched on this a little bit too about the ways in which, there's all this energy because of Me Too. What changes have you seen through your work? Is there more interest from prosecutors in sort of making sure they're doing the right thing by survivors? Is there like a growing sort of consensus? Do you see a sea change on your side?
I can't say, I wish I could say I've seen a sea change. I don't think I've seen that yet. What I experience most often, and this was my experience in prosecution as well, is that it seems in every office there's 1 or 2 prosecutors who really care and who are really trying. And then the question becomes what happens when they leave, move on, take a different job. Then that office that maybe was doing really well just falls short. So it really has to be a top-down sort of sea change. We have to have the elected officials, the district attorneys in this country saying we care about sexual assault. We're going to invest our resources, our time, our training. We're going to put our best attorneys on this, not our attorneys who don't want to do it. And we also are not so many elected officials, because district attorneys are elected, they care so much about win-loss record that there's often this top-down problem in an office where the DA says, I don't want a losing trial record. So unless your case is a surefire win, don't take it to trial. And as a sexual assault prosecutor, I'm not sure I ever had a case that I felt like was a surefire win, because juries are unpredictable and they do crazy stuff. And so you have to change that climate where you measure success differently for prosecutors. You know, when we start taking cases that we've previously declined to trial, we're going to lose some. And you have to accept that that's going to be the outcome, and not penalize your prosecutors for taking those hard cases to trial. Because really, if you're worth your salt as a prosecutor, you're trying the close cases. The slam dunk should plead out. The ones that belong in the courtroom are the close cases where you should be in there fighting the fight.
Yes, I love that. Well, and you know, I feel like likely that I would think that having a prosecutor who's willing to go to bat for you, even if you lose that case, is still sort of feels closer to justice for a survivor than a prosecutor who's like, sorry, no one thinks that this is, you know, no one thinks that this is valid, so I'm going to drop this case, right?
Absolutely. So I often tell this story. As much as I say you can't be judged on your win-loss record, as a prosecutor, I hated to lose. I don't even like to lose at Monopoly. I am a bad loser, and I readily admit that. And so when I did lose a trial, I was a miserable human being. I would lock myself in my office. I would grump around. I would talk to no one for 3 days. And I would search the want ads for jobs as a barista, because I was pretty sure I shouldn't be a lawyer anymore. And I had lost a particularly hard case with a teenage victim who'd been sexually assaulted by her brother-in-law. And her family supported the brother-in-law. And she felt very alone in the world. But we took it to trial, and it was a hard-fought case. The jury was out a long time. But in the end, they acquitted. And I was in my 3-day funk, pounding in my office, and my legal assistant knocked on my door, and I kind of said, I'm in my 3-day funk, you don't get to talk to me, right? And she said, there's someone at the desk for you, and you're really going to want to take this. And I went up front, and here was my young victim with a bouquet of flowers, undoubtedly bought with her own money, with a card that sits on my desk to this day saying, it doesn't matter to me that we lost. You were the first person who ever believed me. And, you know, that's what I want prosecutors to know, is that those women want you to fight the fight. And the outcome matters less than that you believed them and you supported them and you tried.
Oh my God. I'm like, that is so powerful. And I'm also like, and if you are watching this from the conference, go to Julie's workshop in like 15 minutes.
Yes.
And yeah, learn how to do better by survivors. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for taking the time today to share it with us.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Thanks.